Prior to the reign of Queen Elizabeth I, the proud people of England worked hard for their daily bread. They worked the farms and fields for their lord, each with his own plot of land, paying some of it as tribute to their lord, and keeping the rest to feed one's family. The good book was very clear. Whoever shall not work, neither shall he eat. Taking care of the lazy did them no good, so it was forbidden by anyone, including the church, if an able-bodied individual could not work for their daily bread. Then something strange happened in England. A new type of farming among the lords came about. They realized that if they merged all the fields together and had their serfs farm them collectively, individuals could specialize and the better farmers could grow larger amounts of crops instead of the hit or miss done by many plots of land. Even better, the lords no longer needed nearly as many workers. It was wonderful. Higher yields, bountiful fields, and the lord had to pay less people. Everyone was happy. Or it should have been. But at the very same time, a strange rash of lazy vagabonds began to appear in England. These dirty, worthless pieces of sinful sloth came from far and wide. They traveled without a job. The concept baffled the people of England. Some of these people begged for food, even though they were clearly able-bodied. The people did not work, and the holy word was clear. Therefore, no one fed these sinful heathens. If you were without gainful employment, you were given the appropriate punishment: whipping, the stocks, prison, or you were ran out of town in disgrace. A nation that has survived the Black Plague just 100 years ago now had a plague of this vile sin. And where were these terrible people coming from? Well, from the feudal communities, of course. They had switched to this new, more efficient system of farming. People who had only known farming all their lives were suddenly without land to farm. Some resorted to poaching in the Queen's Forest to survive, which had dire consequences. With little education, many looked around for day labor, any way to make ends meet, but with so many competing people in the same situation, only those who had specialized skills that they had cultivated along with their farming by sheer luck stood any chance. The English people came across a concept they couldn't wrap their minds around, and had no words for, precedent, or framework to deal with this new wave of unemployed people. It took decades with communication and ideas slow to transmit, while many unemployed people suffered the shame, abuse, and discrimination of their fellow citizens. It was not until the middle of Queen Elizabeth's reign that a new term arose, the undeserving poor, with sweeping proclamations that changed not only the lives of the unemployed, but the very minds of the people of England. People who were unemployed through no fault of their own and were looking for work were now considered undeserving poor, and it was now the duty of churches everywhere to help out these poor people. This became one of the earliest forms of unemployment insurance. The rise of mercantilism, the rise of both industrial revolutions, the Gilded Age, each wave showed newer prosperity, but also bigger volatility and ever-increasing complex markets. With every boom there was a bust. With every decade, more people switched from their agrarian lives to work in factories or mines. Less and less people were needed to farm. And with each bust, a new crop of unemployed were produced, often treated with as much disdain and unwillingness to help them for their own good as were in Elizabethan England, as the periods of boom made people unable to understand the concept of not being able to find work until more and more of them were caught up in its clutches. The progression of automation marches on victoriously, doing more and more amazing things, but leaving casualties in its wake. The Luddites during the first Industrial Revolution didn't stand a chance when they went around and destroyed textile mills that were making their centuries-old handcrafts obsolete. One by one, jobs taken by humans were replaced with better efficiency and cheaper, more competitive goods. Every time a new technology came about, it was musical chairs and someone was always left out when the music stopped. If, in good times, there were enough other jobs that one of these people could shift to and gain experience in a new budding field, that was great. But in crashes, these people were treated as tramps and hobos, worthless, lazy, and obviously deserving of God's punishment. The 1920s showed the biggest boom and then the biggest bust the world had ever seen. On top of the US stock market crashing, the rest of the world began having trade wars and forced devaluation of their currencies in a bid to make their exports more affordable. The crisis got even worse worldwide. Germans, who were not only broke but deeply indebted to France and England, paying war reparations, saw a wheelbarrow of Deutschmarks required to pay for a loaf of bread. It was only during this extreme time of desperation that the once most rational people of Germany turned to a great savior by the name of Adolf Hitler. During the Depression, less people lived on farms or homestead than ever in the US, as it took less and less people to farm with each new innovation. With lending for new business stuck on stagnant, no one had a way to feed themselves, unless they were already farmers living in areas not affected by the Dust Bowl. Hoovervilles of the poor and destitute cropped up all over the nation. This was a concept that fit nowhere into the minds of the American people, and they struggled to fit this round peg of poverty into their square hole of what they learned to believe about capitalism during the 20s. Franklin Delano Roosevelt changed the vocabulary of this confused nation. He created brand new agencies, including the WPA, that paid people not for things that the market particularly valued, but that made the nation a slightly better place to live. Specifically because he didn't want to create a competition with businesses and put more people out of work. This put money into circulation because, unlike the wealthy who saved what they didn't spend, these impoverished people spent nearly every cent they received, which created more jobs to support them. National parks and monuments, historical building restoration, photography and journalism, the arts and plays. These people received a paycheck not for doing something the market demanded, but because they were doing something, and it was deemed they shouldn't have to starve just because the market believed they did. Thanks to a combination of heavy regulation on banks, a spike in unionization, and the rest of the world shattered by World War, the US came out on top as the biggest superpower in the world. Of course, at the same time, another superpower emerged, one that just a few decades ago was considered the epitome of backwater and impoverished, the USSR. Say what you will about Stalinism, but in spite of the gulags and human rights abuses, communism took a backwater agrarian society and put it scientifically on par with one of the greatest capitalistic nations in the world in a matter of decades, to the point that we feared we would lose the space race. A little-known fact by many in the US is that Karl Marx wrote the Communist Manifesto not because he hated capitalism. As a matter of fact, in the Communist Manifesto in 1849, he spent much of the introduction praising the bourgeois capitalism for its amazing efficiency and scientific advances in automation, and dropping the cost of once impossible to afford goods. The problem was exactly that of labor and the constant removal of jobs by automation. If workers owned the automation collectively, the workers could all grow financially. If individuals owned the automation, they would grow financially off the backs of labor, ensuring a continuing financial divide between rich and poor. Sadly, because Gandhi and Martin Luther King didn't exist at the time, Marx had no issues calling for violent revolution in places where peaceful political revolution seemed impossible, basing his only historical precedent on the American and French revolutions. The manifesto also had a naive view of the power and goodness of government. Because of this, his calls for freedom of speech and democracy were tossed aside by both Stalin and Mao and replaced with a brutal regime of fear and thought police, all in the name of Marx. Communism, or this very imperialistic version of it, began spreading throughout the world at a pace that made the very wealthy in America very scared. The McCarthy witch trials began eroding at the freedom of speech we thought we held dear. Not saying the pledge, loving Jesus, working hard, striving to spend more money made you a suspect communist. However, a very positive thing happened as well. We spent an amazing amount on our infrastructure and science, more than any other nation on the planet had ever seen. In 11 years from Sputnik to the moon landing, we used government spending for this capitalistic nation to conquer space. This increased the automation, boosting faster than ever in existence. America went through some small recessions starting in the late 70s, as we realized our oil was no longer local, but an international market. And starting with the Reagan era, the recession got slowly more painful to the workers. Then the Cold War was over. There was no one left to challenge our greatness as a nation. All of that science and infrastructure spending we had done during the threat of the commies taking over now became communism itself. The dot-com bubble bursting hurt the early George W. Bush term, when web pages went from something only computer elites could make to something a middle school child could make. But since declaring war on other nations was rationalized, one of the only non-communist use of government funds, we went full bore into 2 wars using no-bid contracts and literally losing billions of dollars in the process in Iraq and Afghanistan. It's estimated that $6 trillion were lost and put on the nation's credit card. Take the amount of lost jobs and wages, data shows that all the gains of the middle class made following the war has now been lost, creating some of the worst wealth inequality in American history. And all of this due to marching automation. Immigrants are always a good scapegoat when it comes to job losses. However, the number of good jobs taken by immigrants or outsourcing is a tiny fraction compared to jobs taken by automation. At the moment, there are 2 political parties in the US. One that views government spending on infrastructure, education, science, and a strong safety net with a progressive tax system will create new strong jobs and rebuild America. The other takes a more Elizabethan approach to government, believing removing all government protections for the poor will discourage their laziness, and removing all government regulation and pay laws will return all of our jobs to us. However, both of these views are living in the old paradigm. In the recession, most of the good jobs we lost were replaced by minimum wage service industry jobs. Labor unions are getting more and more decimated to the point that they have barely any political power to advocate for the working class anymore. Service industries are the only jobs to provide work for unskilled labor that cannot be outsourced ever, and are working hard to unionize to raise the minimum wage, as menial labor for the average person in factories during the 1950s and 60s was the equivalent to $25 per hour, and a milkman could afford a house and a car. However, since the service industry in our minds is classified as the labor of high school students, automation sent a large number of Americans from the middle class to the lower class in a matter of a decade. And even if these service industry workers unionize, automation will undo all of that in 20 years. 45% of all jobs are looking to be destroyed by automation in the next 20 years, and just expect that number to continue to ramp up over the continued century. Not because people are lazy, just compared to automation, they are useless. This world is beginning to see a pandemic of uselessness, and unless we change how we think about this, history could go 2 ways. We must change our entire paradigm about work, laziness, and labor, where those persecuted deserving poor could become a large section of the nation. We could continue to do things the way we always have, blaming the more and more useless people with or without a high education for their own plight. As the elite wealthy own more and more of the means of production, gleaning research and science free from the government, as well as infrastructure and education, these elites will continue to get wealthier and more powerful than ever before. Unemployment at 25 to 35 in 20 years could be quite probable, as the market has no use for these people. Some may come up with clever yet pointless jobs out of charity, but as people no longer spend money out of poverty, no one can afford to buy things from the very powerful companies, slowing down innovation. This slowdown in innovation may very well not exist in other nations with better, more stable safety nets. We will continue to have booms and busts on a regular scale as governments will intervene, creating enough jobs through direct spending or through private sector government contracts to get us to the next crisis, when the next technology will destroy more jobs from the market. Since the wealthy control the means of production, they will have incredible political power, possibly even more than they have now. At a certain point, we will be the greatest, most powerful, most technologically advanced nation with the largest number of poor and impoverished barely scraping by, much like we are right now. Or we could change how we view labor and uselessness. Ever since early stone tool making, the human mind has invented ways to work smarter, not harder. Each advancement built off the last one to make our lives easier, so we have more time to do other things. Humanity became a force to be reckoned with when we stopped all focusing on farming and certain individuals specialized in certain areas. Everything we are experiencing right now is what we've always been striving for. As technology has picked up at an exponential rate, so has the potential free time and leisure. But in the US, that has not become the case. We are either overworked or not working at all. Germany and Belgium match the US in productivity, but only work around 37 hours a week with little to no overtime and get paid more than we do. While they are at work, they have the mental energy to focus solely on their job and make fewer mistakes because their minds are well rested. They're also required to have 6 weeks of paid vacation every year across the board, no matter what job you do. They view work as a precious commodity, and it should not be hoarded. John Maynard Keynes predicted that automation would have the US working 15 hours a week, and the congressional projections in the 1970s projected us as working 20 hours a week. Many people in the current corporate job market feel like their job is meaningless. Many do not take the time off allowed because they fear that people will realize that there's no difference when they leave, but the job pays too well for them to quit and change careers. The 80-20 rule often applies, where 80% of the work is done in 20% of their day, and the rest of the time is spent trying to look like they're working. In other jobs, if they spent 8 hours focusing on their job, they would become mentally exhausted and make mistakes. Instead, they have to kill time at work trying to pace themselves or burn themselves out. If jobs paid well enough and working hours were viewed as a scarcity like it is in Northern Europe, as opposed to the view that taking time off is laziness, we would have a healthier, happier, much more efficient population. 70% of all GI sickness is shown to be caused by sick people coming into work in the food industry because they can't afford to skip work, and nearly 30% of all illnesses would be eliminated from America if people had paid sick leave to stay at home and not spread it to their coworkers. But minimum wage jobs aren't considered worth getting paid sick leave for. Studies show that manual labor improves as pay rates increase. However, intangible, thought-intensive, or creative-based work is actually hampered by too little pay that leaves them stressed out, but also after a certain pay level, pay no longer has any positive effect on quality of work or efficiency. The brain has a limit to how much it can stay focused, and the Germans use this information gleaned from labor science to their advantage, a field of research which most in the US are completely oblivious to. Companies in Germany know that if there is no middle-class spending, then no one will buy their goods. Because none of this hoarding of labor exists, Germany has one of the lowest unemployment rates in the Western world. However, even they are not immune from the march of automation, and they are continually mulling introducing even shorter work weeks to spread the labor around. They have now made all universities free, even to foreigners, as it not only pays for itself by creating workers in higher tax brackets, like the GI Bill did after World War II, and attracting highly educated foreign labor, it acts as foreign aid and diplomacy and ensures foreign aid goes directly to people who will take the knowledge back to their country and make it better as opposed to handing the money over to a corrupt government. As automation continues, no one without some form of higher education will be able to work. The belief that poverty is a driver for people working hard and educating themselves is a myth. Social status, feelings of achievement, and desire to better oneself is plenty. The more educated a populace is, the better impulse control and abilities for cost-benefit analysis they have, as they can think ahead using hypotheticals, increasing IQ and lowering crime, which increases the efficiency of society overall. As while our unemployment numbers at the end of 2014 somewhat match that of Germany, they also have around 1/10 the prisoner per capita that we have. That skews the comparative data. Germany and Switzerland are even considering a radical idea that is actually endorsed by some conservative, libertarian, socialist, and liberal American economists, including Milton Friedman, that the government should give a living stipend to everyone. While it sounds like a communist nightmare on the face of it, even conservatives know that welfare and entitlement programs generate a lot of waste thanks to red tape and means testing. It divides people because they all see each other as getting something they aren't getting unfairly. Replacing all social programs with a monthly stipend tied to inflation and cost of living, regardless of income, would eliminate all homelessness overnight. All this housing sitting empty will be immediately filled, and more spending would occur. Much like Social Security, it would stabilize the market with a steady income stream, and like old farm living, a recession would now really only impact the wealthy severely. Considering the power of the government right now, the stipend system would not add or remove the power of the government it has over you now. With its taxing, welfare, and subsidy powers, the only difference is everyone would get the same amount from the government, and no one would get special treatment. Taxes on businesses and the more wealthy would be much higher, but the efficiency of the system would be much higher as well, eliminating entire federal agencies. Jobs would be spotty at best, the more automation picks up, and employers wouldn't have to distinguish regulatory differences between full-time and part-time benefits, allowing them to use less hours to have more efficient and well-rested workers. This system would not destroy capitalism. If anything, it would preserve it, as its view of it by the next generation is become more and more negative. This stipend would be a baseline amount of money everyone in society was entitled to. It would hardly be a luxury, and people would misspend it, but the money would ensure that only the truly wasteful would do without the basic necessities in life. Loans will probably be limited and based on your work status, other than perhaps housing, and more of that stipend may very well be off limits to gleaning. After that, any job you would do would provide more and more options for what you could buy. Options are the entire point of making more money. The fear of poverty quite often makes you worse at your job. The stipend system would ensure there would no longer be a need for a minimum wage, as people no longer worried about surviving could actually work for as much or as little as they wanted based on the current market forces. Pretty much all studies show that most people view work as something they desire and crave to do. It gives them meaning in life, social interactions, and social status. Only around 5% would truly prefer to do no work at all, and more than half of these people have psychological conditions that, if treated, could be eliminated from this group. Without creativity, effort, and seeing results, be it charity work, design, or just a hard day of manual labor, the mind will lose focus and purpose. Money is a social tool to drive motivation and exchange. There is nothing inherently magical about it, but some have forgotten its social importance, and they have become obsessed with having all of it, leading to many hardworking people with none of it. Some German think tanks are running this experiment with this stipend system on certain volunteers. We know that nearly all of us have some idea or hobby we wish we could try out and focus on. Unfortunately, we must continue to work hard at our jobs to survive. Some people from this experiment may very well use this newfound spare time to create a new niche market, creating new jobs. The majority of these people probably won't, but you don't need them all to. Just enough with new innovations to provide labor to many. Probably not most of them, though just like with the WPA, quite probably most of these people will find non-market driven ways just to make life and society a bit better, volunteering and spending time with their creativity and passions. In Jeremy Rifkin's book, The Zero Marginal Cost Society, when everyone has advanced 3D printers and all cars in transit are self-driving, on top of public and private economies, there will be what's referred to as social capital. There are already websites out there where people trade social capital credits. It's similar to a barter system, but it is an exchange for services among individuals, and they will freely trade their energy and labor with their new free time created by automation. The stock market and government agencies and charities will take a smaller role in the economy. Zero marginal cost society is the precursor to the post-scarcity society. But both of these will only be good for the average human being if we can get our political system in order and be ready for it. Another alternative is to require transfer of 51% of stock of any company over to the employees, allowing them to have a say in who gets on the board of directors and specific changes that occur in the company. Perhaps allowing a business to have a 70-year private or public ownership like a copyright law, or requiring the change if the person would like to sell the business. This will allow the individuals who started the company more than enough time to enjoy the business and the fruits of their labors, and most of our corporations have very much outlived their original founders. The stock could be part of the employee's retirement, and if they switch companies, their retirement funds could buy stock in the next company they are employed by. As most service industry companies no longer provide retirement or wages that would even come close to allowing a worker to buy stock, it would require a change in a lot of labor issues. The workers would own the means of production, and the regulated free market would still run things as opposed to the government. The Labour Party in Britain and other parties in America need to change their name to the Labour and Automation Party. Focusing solely on labor is the wrong way to do this now. Focusing on the destruction of labor and scarcity and the increasing level of free time and products brought about by the wonders of automation is the only way we can and should view the future of a nation. This pandemic of uselessness is coming, and it's coming for you and your job. Next to the concept of climate change, it is one of the biggest paradigm shifts the world will have to adjust to in the next century. Visiting the elderly and sick or raising kids may be decided to be a social service that should be rewarded in the future, instead of the system we currently have now, where we are so exhausted from working that the energy to do all that is often an extra burden, and many elderly people are left alone feeling isolated from humanity. Unless we stop using words like laziness, moochers, and unemployed as derogatory terms for anyone not working, we will all be in that category at some point. People will fill any job available if the social status and extra choices are available for doing so, especially as menial labor becomes a thing of the past. Punishing people for not finding jobs that don't exist is like the old phrase, the beatings will continue until morale improves. Quite often, the objections by the common person to welfare and increased minimum wage is due to how overworked and underpaid they themselves currently are, and view that as a baseline instead of viewing an increase in the baseline as helping everyone. There were only two eras in world history where a large middle class was the norm. Right after the Black Plague, when labor was so scarce they could demand higher wages, and in the 1950s to the 1970s, when the government was spending tons on infrastructure, science, and the European infrastructure. Unions were strong and minimum wage was the highest ever. Coming down from such a middle class in both cases led to a serious inability to view poverty for what it was, a shortage of labor and not laziness, but a flaw in the system that need repaired. It led to persecution, denigration, abandonment, and needless suffering, as well as imprisonment. We stand on the precipice of history in our thinking. We can either embrace this new gift for all that science and technology has given us with heavy skepticism of our government and political activism to ensure this government's new power over our livelihoods doesn't go to their heads, or we can do what we've always been doing, swinging from government creating new jobs that are quickly destroyed by automation, then swinging back to the Elizabethan model, treating the unemployed as leeches on society. The question comes down to if we as a species can switch our paradigms about work and laziness as fast as automation and technology is advancing. The first Gilded Age was caused by the inability for people to change their ideals and definitions when we moved from the agrarian age to the industrial age. The second Gilded Age was caused by the inability for people to change their ideals and definitions when we moved from this industrial age to the robotic age. I highly recommend you look at the links below in the bottom bar. Quite a few of them, including one from Reason.com, back up my claim about basic minimum income, along with, of course, CGP Gray's video, Humans Need Not Apply.